The autumn of 1760 marked a pivotal moment in British history as the health of King George II, sovereign of Great Britain and Ireland, rapidly declined. Afflicted with blindness in one eye and hearing impairments, the aged monarch faced the inevitable challenges of advancing age. However, it was the morning of the 25th of October that witnessed a sudden and unexpected turn of events, culminating in the demise of George II and ushering in a transformative chapter for the British monarchy. In the autumn of 1760, the health of King George II, King of Great Britain and Ireland, had significantly deteriorated. By October of that year, he was not only blind in one eye, but also hard of hearing, signalling the challenges that he faced maintaining his physical well-being. It was against this backdrop of declining health that a pivotal moment unfolded on the fateful morning of the 25th of October. On that day, George II adhered to his routine, rising at the customary hour of 6 a.m. His morning ritual included the consumption of a cup of hot chocolate, a seemingly mundane act that belied the historic significance of impending events. Following his morning beverage, the king proceeded to his close stall, intending to attend to personal matters and privacy. However, the ordinary quickly gave way to the extraordinary. A few minutes into his private moment, a loud crash echoed through the royal chamber, prompting immediate concern. The king's valet, alerted by the unexpected disturbance, hastened to the scene. To his dismay, he discovered George II on the floor, a peculiar sight given the circumstances. Frank Nichols, the king's physician, later documented the scene, noting that George II appeared to have just come from his necessary stool. The sudden and unexpected nature of the event left those in attendance bewildered, as the sovereign lay incapacitated on the chamber floor. Efforts were swiftly undertaken to address the situation. The fallen monarch was carefully lifted and placed into his bed, and Princess Amelia, a member of the royal family, was urgently summoned to his side. Tragically, before she could reach him, George II had already drawn his final breath. At the advanced age of nearly 77, he had outlived all of his English or British predecessors, leaving behind a legacy that had spanned decades. A subsequent post-mortem examination would shed light on the cause of George II's sudden demise. The findings revealed that he had succumbed to a thoracic aortic dissection, a serious and often fatal medical condition involving a tear to the aorta. This unforeseen and silent assailant had claimed the life of the aging monarch, marking the end of his reign and ushering in a new era for the British monarchy. The passing of George II held profound implications for the line of succession. His grandson, George III, ascended to the throne, inheriting the responsibilities and challenges that came with the royal mantle. The transition of power, though inevitable, signified a pivotal moment in British history. In accordance with regal traditions, George II was laid to rest on the 11th of November, with Westminster Abbey serving as the final resting place for the departed monarch. The grandeur of the Abbey, steeped in history and tradition, provided a fitting setting for the interment of a ruler who had witnessed and shaped significant chapters in the annals of the nation. The king's instructions for his burial added a poignant touch to the proceedings. George II had left explicit directives for the sides of his and his wife's coffins to be removed, a symbolic gesture that allowed their mortal remains to intermingle for eternity. This act of unity in death bespoke a desire for eternal togetherness, transcending the boundaries of earthly constraints. As the nation mourned the loss of its monarch, historians and contemporaries alike reflected on the reign of George II. His longevity, marked by triumphs and challenges, had left an undeniable imprint on the pages of history. The events surrounding his death served as a reminder of the fragility of life, even for those who occupied the lofty heights of power. The legacy of George II endured beyond the confines of his mortal existence, his reign characterized by political shifts, military conflicts, and cultural transformations, contributed to the evolving narrative of the British monarchy. The chapter that closed with his passing paved the way for a new era, one that would be shaped by the aspirations and endeavours of his successors. In the aftermath of George II's demise, the echoes of his reign reverberated through the corridors of power and the collective consciousness of the nation. The transition of leadership, accompanied by the rituals of mourning and burial, underscored the cynical nature of monarchy and the perpetual march of time. As the sovereign found his final repose in the hallowed grounds at Westminster Abbey, the intricate tapestry of British history absorbed another thread. The death of George II was not merely the end of an individual's journey, but a juncture that marked the intersection of past and future, a moment that would shape the destiny of a nation for generations to come. In the wake of George II's passing, his legacy became an integral thread woven into a rich tapestry of British history. The rituals surrounding his death, from the post-mortem revelation of thoracic aortic dissection to the symbolic gesture of intermingling coffins, underscored the profound impact of his reign. As the nation mourned and reflected on the cynical nature of monarchy, George II's departure became a poignant chapter, reminding all of the transient nature of power and the enduring legacy left by those who once occupied the throne. In both 1801 and 1804, he experienced subsequent relapses, leading to his reclusion at Dutch House once again. Although he recovered from these relapses, it became evident that both his mental and physical health were in a state of decline. The ultimate blow arrived in 1810, already afflicted with near-total blindness caused by cataracts. The king suffered a final devastating mental breakdown that left him permanently insane. Throughout the last decade of his reign, he appeared a sorrowful and solitary figure, aimlessly wandering the corridors of Windsor Castle, clad in tattered garments and sporting an unkempt, flowing beard. He seemed akin to a haunting spectre. While his beloved wife Charlotte passed away in 1818, George no longer recognised her and did not experience any sense of mourning. On the 29th of July 1820, King George III passed away at the age of 81, with a reign lasting 60 years. He holds a record as the longest-serving male monarch in British history. Only his niece Victoria and his descendant Elizabeth II would later surpass his length of reign. Therefore, what was the underlying cause of King George's madness? During that time, mental health breakdowns were attributed to imbalances in the four humours, leading to the atrocious treatments the king endured as physicians aimed to extract his illness and restore balance to his humours. As modern medicine emerged, the concept of humours was debunked, prompting the search for a new explanation for the king's deteriorating health episodes. In the 1960s, American psychiatrists Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter, a mother and son duo, diagnosed the king with porphyria, a genetic disorder that seemed to align with his symptoms of stomach issues, sleep disturbances, discoloured urine, and bouts of insanity. However, recent years have witnessed disputes over the diagnosis of porphyria, leading to the belief that George likely suffered from a severe form of bipolar disorder. It is now theorized that his final descent into insanity resulted from a combination of his debilitating mental illness and the onset of dementia. Although certainty eludes us, this explanation appears more plausible than porphyria. Regardless of the underlying cause of George's madness, he was widely beloved as a monarch during his lifetime. Contrary to the portrayal of a deranged and tyrannical ruler in American folklore, George was a wise, just, and well-liked king. His reign was characterized by support for Britain, advancements in the arts and sciences, and a forward-thinking mindset, which positioned him as one of the most enlightened and progressive kings in Europe. The fact that he suffered from an illness that could have been addressed through modern medical treatments and cognitive behavioral therapy is a tragic consequence of living in an era that lacked sufficient knowledge and compassion. A magnificent and imposing spectacle unfolded when King George III passed away on the 29th of January 1820, which came shortly after the country mourned the loss of his son, Edward, Duke of Kent, just 6 days earlier. The announcement of his death was signalled by the resounding toll of the great bell of St. Paul's Cathedral at midnight. The proclamation of George IV's accession to the throne was deliberately postponed by a day to avoid coinciding with the anniversary of King Charles I's execution on January the 30th. The ceremonial lying in state took place in the royal apartments at Windsor Castle on the morning of the 15th of February, followed by the funeral and interment at St. George's Chapel the following evening. According to the Globe newspaper, the casket was draped with an exquisite holland sheet and a purple velvet pall. It was carried by 10 yeomen of the guard under a majestic canopy of purple velvet. The procession was lined by grenadiers of the foot guards, with every fourth man carrying a flambeau to illuminate their path. Remarkably, the newly crowned George IV was absent from the proceedings. Instead, his beloved brother, Frederick, who had always held a special place in their father's heart, led the mourners. However, concerns lingered about the new king's own deteriorating health, raising fears of yet another royal funeral in the near future. Welcome, join me in the captivating journey back in time as we delve into a pivotal moment in history, the passing of King George IV. In this intriguing episode, we shall explore the life, fashion, controversies, and enigmatic personality of a monarch who left an undeniable mark on the Regency era. From his influence on trends to his complex relationships and profound impact on British society, join us as we unravel the layers of this multifaceted ruler and the circumstances that surrounded his final moments. Prepare to immerse yourself in a tale of politics, fashion, and character as we unveil the compelling narrative of the demise of King George IV. George's excessive alcohol consumption and self-indulgent way of life had a detrimental impact on his health by the late 1820s. During his time as the Prince of Wales, his extravagant feasts and excessive alcohol intake led to obesity, resulting in mockery when he made rare public appearances. By 1797, his weight had reached a staggering 245 pounds, and by 1824, his corset had to accommodate a waistline of 50 inches. He suffered from gout, arteriosclerosis, peripheral edema, and possibly porphyria. In his final years, he spent entire days confined to his bed, experiencing intense and severe episodes of breathlessness. George's later years were characterized by a steady decline in both physical and mental health, as well as a withdrawal from public affairs. Privately, a senior aide to the king noted in his diary, "A more despicable, cowardly, self-centered, unfeeling individual does not exist. There have been virtuous and wise kings, though not many, and I believe this one to be among the worst." By December 1828, much like his father, George had almost completely lost his eyesight due to cataracts, and his severe gout in his right hand and arm had rendered him unable to sign documents. In mid-1829, David Wilkie reported that the king was visibly wasting away day by day, and his obesity had reached a point where he resembled a large sausage squeezed into casing. To alleviate intense bladder pains, George resorted to taking laudanum, often leaving him in a state of drugged and mental impairment for extended periods of time. In September 1829, he underwent surgery to remove a cataract, during which he regularly consumed over 100 drops of laudanum before official occasions. By the spring of 1830, George's impending demise was evident. Mostly confined to his bedchambers and having lost complete sight in one eye, he likened himself to a blind as a beetle, needing to endorse legislation with a stamped signature in front of witnesses. His weight had ballooned to 280 pounds, and frequent bouts of breathlessness caused by dropsy forced him to sleep upright in a chair, and doctors frequently drained excess fluid from his abdomen. Despite his visible deterioration, George was commended for stubbornly clinging to life. His tenacity and appetite were astonishing, and in April 1830 the Duke of Wellington wrote that the King's breakfast consisted of a pigeon and beefsteak pie, 3/4 of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy, all followed by a hefty dose of laudanum. Writing to Maria Fitzherbert in June, the King's physician, Sir Henry Halford, noted, "His Majesty possesses a robust constitution, and his resilience under the most severe strain exceeds anything I have witnessed in 38 years of experience." While George had been under Halford's care since the Regency period, the doctor's social aspirations and perceived lack of competence faced severe criticism, with the Lancet denouncing Halford's health updates on the King as completely devoid of information. Halford's treatment of George, which involved administering both opium and laudanum as sedatives, was seen as lacking coherence or purpose. George dictated his final testament in May and entered a phase of profound devotion during his last months. He made a confession to an archdeacon, expressing his remorse for his dissolute way of life and hoping for mercy due to his efforts to prioritize the well-being of his subjects. By June, his ability to recline was compromised, and on the 14th of that month he received the sacrament in the presence of Lady Conyngham, Halford, and a clergyman. Although Halford officially informed the Cabinet on the 24th of June that the King's persistent cough is accompanied by significant expectoration, he privately confided to his wife that "things are drawing to a close, and I anticipate being liberated around Monday." Around 3 in the early hours of June the 26th, 1830, at Windsor Castle, George awakened and experienced a bowel movement characterized by a substantial evacuation mixed with blood. He immediately summoned Halford, reportedly exclaiming to his attendants, Sir Henry, fetch him, this is death!" Accounts of George's final moments and his last utterances diverge. According to Halford, after his swift arrival along with Sir William Knighton, the King's lips turned bluish, and he rested his head on the page's shoulder. "I reached the upstairs within 5 minutes, and a mere 8 minutes later he had passed away." Other narratives recount that the King placed his hands on his abdomen and uttered, "Certainly this must be death," or that he exclaimed, "Good God, what is this?" and clasped the hand of his page, stating, "My boy, this is death." George's passing occurred at 3:15 a.m., and an autopsy conducted by his attending physicians unveiled that George had succumbed to upper gastrointestinal bleeding caused by the rupture of a blood vessel in his stomach. An extensive tumour roughly the size of an orange was discovered attached to his bladder. His heart exhibited enlargement, heavily calcified valves, and was enveloped by a substantial layer of fat. The King was interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 15th of July. George's sole legitimate offspring, Charlotte, had perished due to postpartum complications in 1817, shortly after delivering a stillborn son. George III's second son, Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, passed away without progeny in 1827. Consequently, the throne was inherited by George III's third son, William, Duke of Clarence, who ascended as William IV. George earned the moniker First Gentleman of England due to his refined style and manners, and he possessed intellect, wit, and erudition, yet his excessive eating led him to squander much of his potential. The Times remarked that he consistently favoured a woman and a bottle over matters of politics and sermons. The Regency era ushered in a significant shift in fashion, largely influenced by George, and when his political adversaries imposed a tax on wig powder, he abandoned powdered wigs in favour of his natural hair. Opting for darker hues that helped camouflage his size, he popularised pantaloons and trousers over knee breeches for their more relaxed fit. He also introduced a high collar accompanied by a neckcloth to conceal his double chin. His sojourn to Scotland in 1822 played a pivotal role in the resurgence, if not the inception, of the Scottish tartan dress as it is recognised today. Amid the political turmoil rising from Catholic emancipation, the Duke of Wellington expressed a damning assessment of George, labelling him the most wretched man he ever encountered in his entire life, the most self-centered, deceitful, malicious, devoid of any redeeming trait. Nonetheless, Wellington's eulogy in the House of Lords hailed George as the most accomplished individual of his era, commending his intellect and aptitude. Wellington's true sentiment perhaps lay between those two extremes, as he later articulated George was a splendid benefactor of the arts, an extraordinary blend of talent, wit, buffoonery, stubbornness, and goodwill. In short, a fusion of the most contrasting attributes with a substantial inclination towards the positive, an amalgamation I've never witnessed in any character before. Following George's passing, the Times sunkenly captured the sentiment of the elite. No individual has been less mourned by his fellow human beings than this departed king, whose eye had shed a tear for him, whose heart has throbbed with genuine, unselfish sorrow. If he ever had a friend, a truly devoted friend from any walk of life, we assert that their name never reached our ears. Numerous statues of George IV were erected, with a significant portion during his reign. In the United Kingdom, these encompass a bronze equestrian statue by Sir Francis Chantrey in Trafalgar Square, portraying him on horseback. In Edinburgh, the George IV Bridge stands as a principal thoroughfare connecting the Old Town High Street to the north over the Cowgate Ravine. Designed by architect Thomas Hamilton in 1829 and completed by 1835, it bears the appellation of King's Cross, now a major transportation hub on the cusp of Camden and Islington in North London, traces back to a short-lived monument raised in honour of George IV in the early 1830s. A square and adjacent park in St Luke's, Islington, also bear George IV's name. Thank you for listening to Past People, and again, please subscribe to support my channel. The death of King George V. On a notable Tuesday, January 1st, 1936, the world received the awakening news of the passing of King George V. The announcement from Sandringham House, where the king peacefully passed away, stated that the king's death occurred at 11:55 p.m, with the presence of Her Majesty the Queen, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of York, and Princess Royal, and the Duke and Duchess of Kent. At the age of 70, King George V had reigned for over 25 years, almost reaching the milestone of a silver jubilee. Born during the era of his grandmother, Queen Victoria, his full name was George Frederick Ernest Albert. His accession to the throne was unexpected, as his elder brother Albert Victor was initially second in line for succession behind their father Albert Edward. At the age of 12, George commenced his education aboard the HMS Britannia, following the footsteps of his elder brother, under the belief of their father that the Navy provided the best training. While Albert Edward pursued further education at Trinity College, George served in the Royal Navy, allowing him to explore the world. The tragic demise of his elder brother in 1892 unexpectedly positioned George as a second in line for the throne. Consequently, he discontinued his naval career and was bestowed titles by Queen Victoria. It wasn't until 1910, after the passing of his father Edward VII, that George ascended to the throne. His reign faced the turmoil of the First World War, in which he found himself at odds with his cousin, the German Emperor Wilhelm II. Due to the rising anti-German sentiment during the war, King George V decided to change the British royal house's name from Saxe-Coburg in Gotha to Windsor. This decision also led to his family adopting more British-sounding surnames and relinquishing their German titles. Adding to the upheaval, King George V's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, was dethroned during the Russian Revolution in 1917 and placed under house arrest. Despite initial considerations to grant asylum to the Romanov family, deteriorating circumstances for the British people and concerns about the potential spread of revolution to the UK led King George to abandon his plan. A year later, Nicholas II and his immediate family were tragically murdered by the Bolsheviks. Despite being on the victorious side of the First World War, the prolonged years of conflict took a toll on King George V's health. His extensive habit of heavy smoking exacerbated his already existing chronic bronchitis. To alleviate his condition, he frequently undertook trips to the Mediterranean, with his final one occurring in 1925. 3 years after this trip, King George fell seriously ill with sepsis, requiring drainage. The Prince of Wales took over the royal duties for the subsequent 2 years. However, George never fully recovered. His health further declined after the passing of his beloved sister Victoria in December 1935 at the age of 67. Despite doctors' recommendations to curtail his activities, King George insisted on attending the entirety of his sister's funeral procession. A month later, on the 15th of January 1936, complaining of a cold, he was confined to his room at Sandringham House, never to leave it again. In the following days, King George drifted in and out of consciousness, and by the 20th of January his condition had significantly worsened, and his physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, made a controversial decision to administer 3/4 of a grain of morphine. King George V passed away at 11:55 p.m. The decision made by Lord Dawson that night has sparked debates to this day. Was it an attempt to alleviate the king's suffering, or was it something a bit more sinister? Lord Dawson, born on the 9th of March 1864, began his education at University College, London in 1879, completing a Bachelor in Science in 1888. Subsequently, he obtained his Doctor of Medicine degree from the Royal London Hospital in 1893. Lord Dawson's entrance into royal circles commenced in 1907, when he became a physician extraordinary to Edward VII. During the First World War, he served on the Western Front, rising to the rank of Major General in the Royal Army Medical Corps. After the war, he resumed his previous position at the court of King George V. So let's revisit the events of the 20th of January 1936. A statement released by Lord Dawson and the King's other physicians conveyed that the King's life was peacefully nearing its end. Much of the present-day knowledge we have stems from Lord Dawson's personal diary. However, it took nearly 50 years after King George V's passing for the truth contained in his diary to be made public. In Dawson's diary entry, he described that around 11 o'clock, it was apparent that the final stage of the king's life might continue for many hours, unbeknownst to the patient. He explained that waiting through these hours merely prolonged the inevitable, exhausting the observers and hindering any meaningful communication and prayer. Therefore, Dawson took it upon himself to end the king's suffering, injecting 3/4 of a gram of morphine and shortly afterward 1 gram of cocaine into the distended jugular vein. Within a short period, the king's breathing became calmer, his appearance serene, and the physical struggle ceased. Lord Dawson made this decision to ensure the king's dignity and to permit the announcement of his death in the more appropriate morning papers rather than the evening editions. Dawson had been an advocate of euthanasia, which involves intentionally ending a life to alleviate pain and suffering. However, he opposed a move to legalise euthanasia in the House of Lords later in 1936. This topic remains a subject of widespread discussion among historians and physicians. After the release of Dawson's diary in 1986, the New York Times suggested that Dawson had expedited George V's death. It appeared evident that Lord Dawson was fully aware of his actions when he administered the lethal dose that night. Moreover, Dawson acted without the consent of the Queen, who held strong religious beliefs, and the Prince of Wales. While the family agreed not to artificially prolong the king's life and wished to spare him from suffering, it remains debatable whether they would have supported Dawson's actions on that fateful night. King George V passed away that night, surrounded by his close family members, and 2 days after his death, his coffin was transferred from Sandringham House to St. Mary Magdalene Church. The following morning, King George V's coffin was transported to Wolverton railway station, accompanied by his sons walking behind it. Upon reaching King Cross Station in London, the coffin was taken to Westminster Abbey. It stayed there until the 28th of January 1936, during which approximately 800,000 individuals paid their respects to the late monarch. The surviving sons of George V stood guard over their father's coffin, a vigil known as the Vigil of the Princes. Interestingly, many passers-by failed to recognise the four princes who were dressed in full uniform. The funeral procession commenced on the 28th of January at 8:45 a.m. King George V's coffin was placed on the Royal Navy State Funeral Gun Carriage, transporting it to Paddington Station. There, it was loaded onto a train. At stops such as Windsor and Eton Railway Station, the coffin was transferred to another carriage. The final stop was Windsor Castle, where the funeral service was scheduled to occur. As the king's coffin was carried up the chapel stairs, the new King Edward VII and his brothers saluted. The funeral service, although relatively simple, was attended by the king's close family and several other monarchs from around the world, many of whom were closely related to George V. The Book of Common Prayer was recited and Abide With Me was sung during the service. Initially, George V was buried in the royal vault at Windsor Castle before being moved following Queen Mary's death in 1953. Lord Dawson continued in the royal household after King George V's passing. He was granted the title of Viscount Dawson of Penn on the 30th of October 1936 and served during the short reign of Edward VIII. Dawson passed away in London on the 7th of March 1945 at the age of 80. The truth about the events of January the 20th, 1936 was not revealed until 1986, unbeknownst to Edward VIII, George VI, or Queen Mary. When the first volume on Dawson's life was published in 1950, his widow requested the omission of that particular night. At the time when this information emerged, Queen Elizabeth, George V's granddaughter, was reigning, but her reaction to this revelation remains unknown. The only statement from Buckingham Palace was that the incident occurred a long time ago and all those involved were deceased.